For members of the public, the peer review group is established pursuant to state law to have a group of folks who have expertise in the area and who can essentially look over the shoulders of the High-Speed Rail Authority. Mr. Kempton, thank you for joining us from Southern California, and we know you've got a plane to catch. We're going to let you out of here at 8:30 sharp, I promise. What would you like us to know, and both in terms of the conversation we've had previously back in December about the draft plan as we saw it then, and some newer thinking that has surfaced tonight and that hopefully we'll see in more detail when we see a final plan later this month, beginning of next month.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senators. It's good to see you. Good to be back talking to you again. My name is Will Kempton. I am chair of the California High-Speed Rail Peer Review Group, and in my day job, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Orange County Transportation Authority.
And Mr. Kempton, you might tell people who are here your history in Santa Clara County.
I was in Santa Clara County for 7 years, from 1985 to 1992, and I ran an organization called the Santa Clara County Traffic Authority, which was the first transportation sales tax program in California, a $1.1 billion program over 10 years that built the Route 85 freeway, widened 101 from San Mateo to Bernal Road, and upgraded 237 to a full freeway from an expressway at that time.
Thank you.
And prior to your going to Orange County, you were?
I was the State Director of Transportation.
At Caltrans. All right, thank you. Welcome again.
Well, as you've indicated, Mr. Chairman, the voters approved Proposition 1A in 2008, and the state legislature passed legislation which created an independent peer review group. Our purpose is to review the planning, engineering, financing, and other elements of the authority's assumptions for high-speed rail in California. And probably the most critical feature that we're supposed to look at is the financial viability of the authority's financing plan, to look at the sufficiency, the reasonableness of the financing for each corridor that the authority designates to fund pursuant to the Streets and Highways Code. Our review group consists of 8 members. There are 7 members currently serving. I've outlined who those members are for you before, but we do have a new member of our group, and that is Stacy Mortensen, who is the general manager, the executive director of the San Joaquin County Rail Commission, and she was appointed on February 17th by the acting secretary of the Business, Transportation, and Housing Agency. So we have 1 vacancy on the peer review group at this point. Pursuant to the statutory requirements, we did review the funding plan, and we have been in the process that I'll explain in just a moment, reviewing the draft 2012 business plan. But I think the comments that we made on the funding plan were really the essence of the comments that we have on the proposal that is before the legislature with respect to considering whether you're going to fund or appropriate the funding for the bond proceeds. And it's been stated, I think you all have summarized fairly where the peer review group was, and I think that the representatives from the High-Speed Rail Authority have acknowledged where we were. And it was essentially that the question of independent utility of an investment in the Central Valley without connecting to anything, there obviously would be the potential for using that 130 miles of track for the existing Amtrak service there. But we viewed that as having a great risk or a great potential for a stranded investment. In other words, those dollars, that $6 billion or so, $3.3 billion in federal money, $2.7 billion in Prop 1A match, as not being connected to anything and having been, as I described it, a stranded investment. The independent utility of the initial construction segment is, to us, a very large risk associated with the program. We have had discussions with the members of the authority and the staff at the High-Speed Rail Authority, and we have long pressed for the blended approach. Some have called it the shared use approach to doing business. We feel that if investments are made in the bookends that can increase the efficiency of passenger rail service in those bookends, any investment of that nature is not wasted. With or without high-speed rail, those improvements will benefit the public from now in perpetuity. And so that risk was what concerned us mostly about the proposal by the High-Speed Rail Authority to invest initially in the Central Valley. Now, I think Mr. Richard has offered some, cogent reasons as to why they've made the choice to do that. I think it's also pretty apparent from our point of view that the federal government was anxious to get a working track in place, a high-speed rail segment in place, and I think that's also had some influence on the decision for that investment. But again, there is a risk with that investment in our view. And if you were looking at not just the bookends, because some people accuse us of being, parochial in that sense, because we want to attract the dollars down to the regions that many of us live in and represent, the fact of the matter is, if you were looking at a very good place to make an investment in the high-speed rail system, in my view, and I don't necessarily speak for the peer review group on this point, although I believe they would support me on this, the Bakersfield to Palmdale stretch would close a gap that exists in the state's passenger rail system and would provide for some tremendous benefits that could frankly serve to provide a basic system for ultimately building the high-speed rail proposal that's contained in Proposition 1A. Let me talk a little bit about where we are with our review of the actual business plan itself. We were very clear in initial comments on the business plan that we see this document as a very substantial improvement over previous business plans. We think that the High-Speed Rail Authority has worked hard to develop a more realistic set of numbers. Some of our members on the peer review group still have some concerns with respect to ridership and revenue forecasts, but they are certainly more realistic in terms of looking forward. They have, as a matter of fact, identified some of the risks and proposed mitigation for some of those risks. We have concerns that there are additional risks that need to be addressed in a more comprehensive manner. But generally, I think we have seen a business plan, a draft business plan, that really has made great strides in terms of being responsive. And I should step back at this point and make it clear that from the perspective of the new members of the High-Speed Rail Authority, we have seen a very significant change in terms of our initial dealings with the High-Speed Rail Authority staff early on in my tenure with the peer review group. They are much more responsive, much more considerate of the input, and we really appreciate the fact that we've developed a working relationship. We don't agree on everything, I can assure you, but we have at least developed a relationship where we can talk about these things.
Mr. Kempton, let me interrupt for just a
sure.
second and ask you a question from the peer review group and based on your experience. I think there are a number of folks who have echoed that there has been some new thinking as a result of recent appointments, that there's clearly a new approach emerging. For folks who might find some comfort in that new thinking and new approach, but worry about how long-lasting that is, given the fact that members come and go, as we've seen just during the last 3.5 years, what's your suggestion to us about how the kinds of commitments people are asking about can be locked in so that they outlast any particular group of High-Speed Rail Authority board members?
Well, I think if you were to compare the California High-Speed Rail Authority to the California Transportation Commission, and there are some similarities there, decisions made by the Transportation Commission and policy directions approved and directed by the Transportation Commission, they may change over time, but not significantly so. And so I would not anticipate that you would see once we begin to move in a particular direction with respect to implementation, I think that fairly well commits the authority for the future. Again, you may see tweaks, you may see adjustments going forward, but I think that you're going to generally see a substantial program direction that is implemented.
Which means, if I can put words in your mouth, and if I can't, you'll tell me, that we better get the initial direction right, because we're going to be making some commitments here that have long-lasting impact and cost associated with it.
I think that is a true statement. I think that the initial direction is important, and that's why these decisions are as significant as they are.
Thank you. And I apologize if I took you off and you had further comments.
I think I have
Let me go to Senator Lowenthal.
just, if I may summarize what you're saying. You're saying while the federal government certainly wants us and has control over the disposition of that money, wants us to start in the Central Valley, if we had a clean slate now and could do it, what you're saying is you think it would be a lower risk strategy given the financial status of the project to begin the project at the bookends. Is that not what you're saying?
I think that would be a more realistic investment in terms of the long-term benefit, and if no additional funding was made available, those investments would not be wasted.
And if I can jump in for a moment, and to what extent does the discussion of $1 billion at each end of the state assuage those concerns, and to what extent do you think the concern is still present?
Well, I think it's very positive, frankly. I think the proposals that Mr. Richard referenced with respect to memorandums of understanding, in fact, the Southern California Association of Government has just forwarded to the High-Speed Rail Authority a list of projects that could be built in the corridor. I think the dollar amount is something approaching $2 billion, as Mr. Richard referenced. I think that's extremely positive. We've said, the peer review group has said, among other things, that we think that if the authority is going to continue to proceed with the investment in the Central Valley, that they ought to identify which initial operating segment they want to focus on, north or south, and perhaps more importantly to the question is that we think there needs to be an early identification or an early commitment of funding, early investment, if you will, in the bookends, because those investments, as I say, will not be lost.
And what, if anything, excuse me, Senator, what, if anything, could we still, and we'll hear again from Mr. Richard and Mr. Hartnett, we still have the 130 miles in the Central Valley that is, as initially proposed at least, not a high-speed rail system, still conventional rail, still without electrification, still without positive train control, still without high-speed rail rolling stock. What's your thinking about what might be done and when it might be done, if anything, to make that 130-mile segment have a greater standalone value in the event that the additional funding is not forthcoming?
Well, again, I referenced we've been having fairly detailed discussions with the High-Speed Rail Authority on certain issues, and it's my understanding that they are looking at that segment and, you know, is an investment in just tracks appropriate? I think they have been very open to looking beyond what was proposed in the draft business plan, and I'm certain that Mr. Richard and Mr. Hartnett could give you more information on what they're thinking along those lines. But the concept of connecting that 130 miles in some way has not been lost on them, I don't believe. And I think that there are ways that the initial investment, the initial construction segment, could be made more realistic in the sense of how you hook it into existing rail services on which you can build to achieve the ultimate objective.
Let me go back to Senator Lowenthal and then to Senator Craig.
Just to follow up, you did raise, you know, what we're talking about right now, how do we create an existing rail system that can serve as a high-speed rail system ultimately, but that with limited resources, additional resources, you're trying to identify what has the most utility at this moment and what would be the best bang. And you also mentioned that within this system, the biggest gap right now is we do not have a rail system that connects Bakersfield to, let's say, Palmdale. That's just, you have to take a bus. If you want to take a train from Southern California to Northern, or Northern California to Southern California, you can get as far as Bakersfield, and then you have to go out and either hitchhike or catch a bus. That's the way you do it, and then you can. Do you have any idea how much we're talking about to complete, maybe not a total completion, what we're talking about to at least have an existing system that would work? how much that would cost at Bakersfield to Palmdale?
The estimate in current dollars from Bakersfield to Palmdale that's listed in the draft business plan is $8 billion. That's 94 miles from Bakersfield to Palmdale. And the investment that Mr. Richard has proposed, and by the way, I would once again express appreciation for his efforts to bring together the Southern California transportation agencies to try to identify a series of projects. The estimate of the projects that have been identified as a result of his request are about $2 billion. Now, that would
$2 billion
$2 billion
Is what?
It is the piece from Anaheim to Palmdale. The actual dollar amount to Sylmar, because I think the High-Speed Rail Authority would obviously like to see a connection all the way to Sylmar through the Soledad Canyon of high-speed rail service. But again, looking at trying to avoid the additional substantial cost of that, I think for the $2 billion you could sufficiently upgrade the tracks all the way to Palmdale. You could create, that would be grade separations, that would be additional passing tracks, curve alignments, things of that nature that would allow the service, the existing service, to operate at 90 miles an hour between Anaheim and Los Angeles. And by the way, current Metrolink services, even at its fastest, is only 79 miles an hour there. Not a significant improvement, but still a time savings. And then 125 miles an hour from LA Union Station to either Sylmar or Palmdale. And then, you know, whether you provided the high-speed rail connection at Sylmar or at Palmdale, and you could connect to Bakersfield, now you have a system in place on which you can begin to build. I think, as I say, I don't believe any of this has been lost at all. In fact, I think the High-Speed Rail Authority is very cognizant of those opportunities, and I'm hopeful that the business plan recognizes some of that. And if my experience in terms of the responsiveness of this group is any indication, I believe it will.
Senator Correa, to be followed by Senator DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kempton, just the issues of stranded investment, revenues, ridership, projections. If we focused on addressing the bookends first, would that not intuitively lead to higher probability of higher ridership and higher revenues when you begin to invest in the other parts of the high-speed rail?
Well, I think you definitely would have higher ridership because you're serving more people. I'm not sure as to whether or not you'd whet the appetite of folks to move beyond just those existing rail systems.
You go from Anaheim to downtown LA, instead of getting there in 40, 50 minutes, you get there in 20 minutes.
There's no question that higher speed service in the bookends would increase ridership in those corridors.
Senator DeSaulnier.
Mr. Kempton, your original comment was heretofore, before this evening, the initial investment is a very large risk. Anything you heard tonight that would change that opinion?
Well, I'm heartened by the members of the High-Speed Rail Authority and the discussions that we've had. And so I would say it's not necessarily been something that I've heard tonight. It's been something that I've heard over the past 3 months or so in working with the members of the High-Speed Rail Authority. I've said this on a number of occasions. We found them to be receptive to some of the input. They've argued on some of the other input that we provided. So it's, again, not like we are on the same channel with every point. But I really do believe they have listened and have taken the input from the legislature and from our peer review group, and I believe we're very excited, frankly, about seeing what the revised business plan holds, because my sense in dealing with these folks has been that they have been very receptive to many of the comments that we made, and I think the business plan will reflect that attitude.
Mr. Kempton, before I go back to Senator Lowenthal, I think what I've heard you say, and again, you'll correct me if I've got it wrong, is that the directions we've heard about from the authority tonight are encouraging, but that you'd like to see continued emphasis on the bookends as they've been referred to, that you'd like to know a little bit more about which initial operating segment follows so that there's some clarity about where we're headed over the longer term, and that connecting the northernmost to the southernmost piece of the system sooner rather than later is something that it would be helpful to hear more about in the final plan. Have I got your 3 points right?
Well, I don't think I said, articulated the final point as effectively as you just did, but that is true. Those are 3 points that the peer review group would like to see.
All right, let me go back to Senator Lowenthal. Thank you.
Earlier on, the Institute for Transportation Studies raised some concerns about the ridership numbers. And then you re-reviewed their work. Did you discredit the ITS study?
We did not. I mean, I think probably a lot of people think that we did. I believe the issue with the ridership and forecast, the demand modeling, has been that it needs to be open to complete public scrutiny. And that is so, from our perspective, so that you all, as you make your decisions, would have an absolute comfort level with respect to those projections. I will tell you from my perspective, I don't say that they are wrong. It is just to be able to provide the kind of review that would give you the greatest comfort level as you make your decisions in terms of how the dollars.
So you did not discredit their numbers?
I would not characterize what we did as discredit.
That being said, I gather you're very tactfully suggesting some additional transparency would be helpful.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. It falls to me to be less tactful.
Master of
I'll
understatement.
own that. All right. Let me ask a question about timing and funding, and I want to tee this up as well for folks from the High-Speed Rail Authority and from the Legislative Analyst's Office. We, as you heard earlier, we're looking at something on the order of $2.7 billion coming to us in the way of a budget request. For members of the public who are not familiar with our process, the two houses of the legislature each have budget subcommittees that deal with these issues on a topic-by-topic basis. In the Senate, because the Senate has only 40 members, there are only 3 members on the budget subcommittee. I serve as chair, Senator Lowenthal is the second member, and Senator Jean Fuller is the third and final member of that group. Ordinarily, we would have seen a plan and a proposal as part of the administration's budget proposal the first week in January. That has not happened because of some of the changed directions. It is challenging, to say the least, if we do not see an approved final plan before the first week in April. Then in order to meet our constitutional deadline, which we're actually getting closer to meeting these days, of June 15th for a budget, we have about 8 to 10 weeks to look at, quote, the new plan. That raises obvious questions about timing. Do we need to move forward by June 15th with the allocation of funds for construction? Could that decision be delayed a year, given the deadlines that are in place with respect to federal funding? Could it be delayed until January to give the legislature somewhat more time? Could it be delayed and taken up as a standalone budget bill sometime in August before the legislature adjourns? The obvious concern I have is not only about the legislature having ample time, 8 to 10 weeks, not a lot of time to look at something of this complexity and magnitude, but also giving the public time, frankly, up and down the state, as well as groups like the Peer Review Group and the Legislative Analyst's Office, given your other to-do list. So do you have any thoughts on the timing issues?
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, the biggest impact of delay is the potential loss of federal funds. I mean, that's frankly the largest risk associated with that delay. I don't know, it seems to me in conversations that I've had with the federal officials, they've been fairly adamant about the need to meet the deadlines and to get the initial construction segment started. That's something that would have to be explored in greater detail, but you know, I certainly don't think it's necessarily positive that we would forego $3.3, $3.4 billion in federal money that will be a huge benefit to getting the system underway. So if that investment, again, looking forward to the revised business plan, if the proposal that comes out of the High-Speed Rail Authority addresses in some way the questions of independent utility and the issue of a potential stranded investment, if there's a way to give more comfort to the legislature and the decision makers on this, then I think that that's a very positive thing.
I think, and this is not directed to you, it's directed to the High-Speed Rail Authority for when they come back up, and I'm speaking now only as an individual member. Part of the frustration I'm feeling is that if it has taken us 3 to 3.5 years to drag a more credible plan out of the authority, being asked to assess the merit of that plan in a matter of weeks before we take this $6.2 billion step that leads us down a $98.5 billion path is more than a little disconcerting, anxious-making, call it what you will. So I'll raise that issue when folks from the High-Speed Rail Authority come back, because it's a struggle we're going to have to deal with here pretty quickly based on the timeline. Senator DeSaulnier.
Just briefly, Will, the other thing that you have focused on is the lack of identified funding, particularly in proportion to the scale of the capital project. As you know, CTC just came up with a needs assessment that said we were 300% underfunded for existing needs. Mr. Richard has, and others proponents have said, any great project like this is not going to be able to identify a significant amount of their funding. But given that, at least in my time, we have been, because of the economy and other reasons, we've been having more in the black hole to have to go out and find, and given your current job, you haven't had an opportunity here tonight to talk about the still existing problem of we haven't identified any new funding, and the pressure that at least I worry about on our existing lack of funds for infrastructure.
Well, we've, the High-Speed Rail Authority members and some of the folks in our group have had this conversation. I see it a little bit differently than Mr. Richard characterized it earlier today, or earlier this evening. I think that if you look at any major infrastructure project, whether it was the state water project, whether it was the interstate system, whether it was the state college and university systems, while they haven't had all the money in hand to be able to do the project, there has been a source of funding on which to rely going forward. That's one of the issues that we have with the high-speed rail program. It's an unfortunate issue. There is no identified funding. There are some rail programs. There's a rail rehab program that may provide some opportunity. There's the Tiger grants that are coming through the federal government that may provide some limited funding. But there is no other source of money, and a Congress, at least the House, that is committed to not funding high-speed rail, at least for some period of time. I mean, if the president were to have his way, there would be additional funding available for high-speed rail. But he's not been successful in getting that proposal considered in Congress. And so that is a problem from our perspective, is that we don't see that identified funding, and we think that that's obviously an issue that you have to take into account.
And you must take into account, given your current day job, you must be concerned that some of that unidentified funding would come at the expense of already underfunded sources.
We did comment on that aspect of the business plan early on, that relying on federal New Starts funding, as an example, for any high-speed rail improvements is putting us into competition with the high-speed rail program in California. Right. I mean, when I say us, I mean transit operators around the state. We didn't like that, and I honestly believe, again, in discussions with the authority, that they have clarified that point. I don't think that they would see themselves as competitors for those sources of funding. But it still doesn't answer the larger question of where is any additional funding coming from. That's why I think the revised business plan, what it says with respect to laying the groundwork, if the investment has to be made in the Central Valley, okay, the investment's going to be made in the Central Valley. How do you make that more utilitarian, as Mr. Richard mentioned earlier? Can we see early investment in the bookends? That investment will not be lost in terms of public benefit. Is there an opportunity to provide connections along some of the gaps that exist in the state's passenger rail operations? And addressing those sorts of issues, I think, goes a long way towards dealing with the concerns that the High-Speed Rail Peer Review Group has brought up relative to those issues.
Thank you.
Mr. Kempton, it's 8:29. I promised we'd get you out by 8:30. Any parting words here for us?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to make it clear, we actually have delayed submittal of comments on the draft business plan. I talked to several of you. As you remember, the original comment period was extended from December 31st to January 16th, and I talked to, I think, each of you, maybe not Senator Correa on this point, but about the prospect of us delaying our comments until we had a chance to sit down, at the authority's invitation, by the way, to sit down and talk with them about some of the issues that we've had, so that we could maybe have an opportunity to settle those issues and perhaps make our comments more concise. As we now look to the publication of the revised business plan by the end of March, we will be submitting our comments on the draft business plan, and we will be talking about a number of the issues. I've incorporated those in my written testimony just to give you a flavor for some of the things that we'll be mentioning as we send those comments formally to you.
We're going to let Senator Correa get a quick getaway question in before you dash. Thank you.
Hopefully a yes or no question. Answer on that is, if we were to emphasize the investment on the bookends first, would that jeopardize the federal funding?
Yes, I believe it would.
Thank you.
Could you extract?
All right, let me say thank you very much, and I appreciate your willingness to join us here this evening. Let me ask at this point if we could have our two representatives from the Legislative Analyst's Office, Farrah Brockton and Brian Weatherford, come on up, introduce themselves,